The morning sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and amber as Sarah Martinez packed the last of her belongings into the worn leather saddlebag. Her 6-month-old daughter Emma gurgled contentedly from the wooden cradle nearby, tiny fingers reaching toward the dancing dust particles in the sunlight streaming through the cabin window. Sarah paused in her packing, watching her daughter's innocent face, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. 3 days had passed since the telegram arrived, with news that would change everything. Her sister Maria lay dying in Denver, nearly 200 miles away through treacherous mountain passes and unpredictable terrain. The message had been brief but urgent. Come quickly. Bringing the baby. Time is short. Sarah's hands had trembled as she read those words, knowing that this journey would be the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted. Living alone in the remote cabin since her husband's death in a mining accident 8 months earlier, Sarah had grown accustomed to facing challenges on her own. But traveling such a distance with an infant, crossing swollen spring rivers and navigating narrow mountain trails, seemed almost impossible. Yet the thought of Maria dying without seeing her niece, without saying goodbye, made the decision for her. Family was everything, and Sarah would risk anything to honor that bond. The nearest town was Millfield, a small settlement 40 miles east where she hoped to find someone traveling toward Denver who might offer them safe passage. Her horse, Stella, was strong and reliable, but carrying both mother and child across such difficult terrain would test even the sturdy mare's endurance. Sarah had spent the previous day preparing supplies: dried beef, hardtack biscuits, a water flask, warm blankets for Emma and her late husband's rifle, which she prayed she would not need to use. As she lifted Emma into her arms, the baby's bright blue eyes seemed to mirror the uncertainty Sarah felt in her heart. "We're going on an adventure, little one," she whispered, forcing confidence into her voice that she did not entirely feel. "We're going to see Aunt Maria and everything will be just fine." Emma responded with a toothless smile that melted Sarah's fears momentarily, reminding her why this journey was so important. The first day of travel passed without incident. The weather remained clear, and Stella moved steadily along the familiar trails that Sarah had traveled many times before her marriage. Emma slept peacefully in the specially designed carrier that Sarah had fashioned from soft leather and thick blankets, secured safely against her chest. They made good time, covering nearly 20 miles before making camp in a sheltered grove of pine trees. That evening, as Sarah fed Emma by the light of a small campfire, she allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic. Perhaps the journey would not be as difficult as she had imagined. The spring weather had been unusually mild, and the mountain passes she would need to cross in the coming days were reportedly clear of snow. If their luck held, they might reach Denver within a week, giving her precious time with Maria before the worst happened. But as night fell and the fire burned low, Sarah noticed the wind beginning to pick up, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, moving steadily toward them like a vast army preparing for battle. She pulled Emma closer and checked their shelter, reinforcing the canvas tarp she had stretched between 2 sturdy trees. Weather in the mountains could change within minutes, and she knew that tomorrow might bring challenges she had not anticipated. Sleep came fitfully that night. Emma woke twice, fussing and crying until Sarah managed to comfort her, but each interruption left Sarah more tired and anxious about the days ahead. The wind continued to build throughout the night, and by dawn, fat raindrops were beginning to fall, drumming steadily against their makeshift shelter. When morning came, Sarah faced a difficult decision. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and traveling in such conditions with a baby would be dangerous. Yet every day they delayed was another day that Maria grew weaker, another day closer to losing her forever. After careful consideration, she decided to continue, reasoning that staying dry was less important than reaching Denver quickly. The second day proved far more challenging than the first. The rain transformed the mountain trails into slippery, treacherous paths where one wrong step could send both horse and rider tumbling down steep slopes. Stella moved carefully, her iron shoes struggling to find purchase on the wet rocks and muddy ground. Sarah found herself constantly adjusting her grip on the reins while keeping one protective arm around Emma, who remained surprisingly calm despite the harsh conditions. By afternoon, they had covered only 8 miles, less than half their previous day's progress. The rain had intensified, and Sarah's clothes were soaked through despite her oiled canvas coat. Emma mercifully stayed dry and warm beneath the waterproof covering Sarah had arranged. But the baby's feeding schedule was disrupted, and she grew increasingly fussy as the day wore on. As evening approached, Sarah began looking for a place to make camp, but the rain had made everything soggy and miserable. Every potential campsite seemed exposed to the elements or too rocky for comfort. Finally, as darkness began to fall, she spotted a small cave set into the side of a granite cliff. It was not ideal, being barely large enough for herself and Emma, with no room for Stella, but it would provide shelter from the storm. That night, as she listened to the rain pounding outside their tiny refuge and Stella nickering nervously from where she stood tethered beneath a narrow rock overhang, Sarah began to question the wisdom of her decision to make this journey. The weather showed no signs of improving, and they still had more than 150 miles to travel through increasingly difficult terrain. Emma slept restlessly, and Sarah found herself wondering if her determination to reach Maria was worth risking her daughter's safety. But as dawn broke on their third day of travel, bringing with it the first clear skies they had seen since leaving the cabin, Sarah felt her resolve returning. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the previous day's rain. Emma seemed more alert and content, and even Stella appeared eager to continue their journey. Perhaps the worst of their troubles were behind them. The third day brought new challenges as Sarah and Emma approached the most dangerous part of their journey. Ahead lay Thunder Creek, normally a peaceful stream that could be crossed easily on horseback, but the recent rains had transformed it into a raging torrent. From half a mile away, Sarah could hear the angry roar of water rushing over rocks and fallen trees, carrying with it the debris of the storm that had passed through the mountains. When they finally reached the creek's edge, Sarah's heart sank at the sight before her. The normally narrow waterway had swollen to 3 times its usual width, and the current moved with frightening speed, churning brown with mud and debris. Massive tree branches swept past like battering rams, and the sound was deafening, drowning out even Stella's nervous whinnying as the mare sensed the danger ahead. Sarah dismounted and walked carefully along the bank, searching for a safer crossing point. Emma fussed in her arms, perhaps sensing her mother's anxiety, but Sarah barely noticed as she studied the treacherous water. Every potential crossing spot looked equally dangerous. The creek bed, normally visible through clear mountain water, was now hidden beneath the muddy torrent, making it impossible to judge the depth or identify hidden obstacles. For nearly an hour, she explored both upstream and downstream, hoping to find a fallen log or rocky shallows that might offer safe passage. But the storm had washed away the old log bridge she remembered from previous trips, and every ford she had used before was now completely submerged. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were trapped on the wrong side of Thunder Creek with no apparent way across. Returning to where Stella waited patiently with their supplies, Sarah sat on a boulder and tried to think clearly. Going back would mean losing precious days, and she had no idea when the creek might return to normal levels. Spring runoff combined with the recent storm could keep the water high for weeks, but attempting to cross in current conditions seemed like certain death for all 3 of them. As she weighed their options, Sarah noticed Emma had grown quiet, staring with wide eyes at something behind her mother. Turning to follow her daughter's gaze, Sarah saw a lone rider approaching from the direction they had come. The figure was still too distant to make out clearly, but as horse and rider drew nearer, Sarah could see it was a man riding a large black stallion, moving with the confident ease of someone who knew these mountains well. The stranger reined in his mount about 20 feet away and touched the brim of his hat politely. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and the lean build of someone who spent his life outdoors. His clothes were practical and well-worn, and Sarah noticed the easy way he sat his saddle, suggesting years of experience in rough country. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of rushing water. "Name's Jake Morrison. I've been following your trail since yesterday, wondering if you might need assistance." His eyes took in the baby in her arms, the heavily loaded horse, and the impossible barrier of swollen creek water. "Looks like you're facing quite a problem here." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and wariness. In this remote country, a lone woman with a baby was vulnerable, but something in the stranger's manner suggested he meant no harm. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she replied carefully. "We're trying to get to Denver. My sister is very ill." She gestured helplessly at the raging creek. "But this water came up so fast, I'm not sure how to get across safely." Jake dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, studying the current with the practiced eye of someone who had crossed many dangerous waters. He picked up a fallen branch and probed the depths near the bank, then moved upstream and downstream, repeating the process at several points. Sarah watched anxiously as he evaluated their options, hoping he might see something she had missed. "This is Thunder Creek," Jake said finally, returning to where Sarah waited. "I've crossed it dozens of times, but never when it was running this high and fast." He paused, looking at Emma with a thoughtful expression. "There's a spot about a quarter-mile upstream where the creek makes a bend. The water's deeper there, but the current isn't quite as fierce because of how the channel curves. It's still dangerous, but it might be our best chance." Sarah felt her stomach tighten at the word dangerous. She looked down at Emma's trusting face and wondered if she had the right to risk her daughter's life for the sake of reaching Maria, but Jake seemed to read her thoughts, and his expression softened with understanding. "I know it's a hard choice," he said gently, "but I've been through these mountains for 15 years, and I can tell you that creek isn't going down anytime soon. The snowpack is melting fast up in the high country, and there's more rain coming in the next few days. If you wait, it could be 2 weeks or more before it's safe to cross." The mention of more rain made Sarah's decision for her. They could not survive 2 weeks in the wilderness with their limited supplies, and Emma needed proper shelter and care. If they were going to cross, it had to be now, while they still had the strength for such a dangerous undertaking. "What do you suggest?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through every aspect of the crossing. "We'll need to be very careful," he said finally. "I'll go first on my horse to test the footing and find the safest path. Then I'll come back for you and the baby. My horse is bigger and stronger than yours, better able to handle the current." Sarah looked at Stella, who had been her faithful companion through many difficult times. The idea of leaving the mare behind was heartbreaking, but she understood the logic. "What about Stella and our supplies?" "Once we get you and the baby safely across, I'll come back for your horse," Jake explained. "She'll be lighter without riders, and I can lead her across while mounted on my stallion. The supplies we'll have to risk losing, but we can tie the most important things to the saddles." The plan was dangerous, requiring multiple crossings of the treacherous water, but it seemed to offer their best hope of success. Sarah nodded slowly, then looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep despite the chaotic sound of rushing water. "When do we start?" "Right now," Jake replied. "The water level seems to have stabilized, and the afternoon light will help us see any obstacles in the current." He began checking his saddle and bridle, ensuring everything was secure. "But first, let me ask you something important. Can you swim?" Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "No," she admitted. "I never learned." Jake's expression grew more serious, but he did not seem surprised. Many people in the mountains had never had the opportunity to learn swimming, especially women who spent their lives far from large bodies of water. "That makes it more dangerous," he said honestly. "But we'll manage. You'll need to trust me completely and do exactly what I tell you. When I tell you, without hesitation." As Jake prepared for the first crossing, Sarah realized she was about to place her life and her daughter's life in the hands of a complete stranger. She knew nothing about him except his name and his apparent familiarity with the country, but something in his calm competence and the gentle way he had spoken to her gave her confidence that he was indeed trying to help them, not harm them. Jake led them upstream to the bend he had mentioned, where the creek curved sharply around a granite outcropping. Here the water was indeed deeper, but the current seemed slightly less violent as it swirled around the curve. Sarah watched nervously as Jake studied the crossing point one final time, his experienced eyes reading the water like a map of hidden dangers. "See that line of darker water there?" Jake pointed to a diagonal path across the creek. "That's where the bottom is most solid. The lighter brown water indicates softer mud or loose gravel that could trap a horse's hooves." He turned to Sarah with a serious expression. "When we make our crossing, we'll follow that line exactly. If my horse starts to struggle or lose footing, I may have to make quick decisions. Whatever happens, keep holding tight to me and don't let go of the baby." Sarah nodded, though her mouth felt dry with fear. Emma had awakened and was looking around with the curious expression babies wore when experiencing something completely new. The sound of rushing water seemed to fascinate rather than frighten her. and Sarah took some comfort in her daughter's calm demeanor. Jake mounted his black stallion and guided the powerful animal to the creek's edge. The horse snorted and danced nervously, clearly sensing the danger ahead, but Jake's steady hands and calm voice kept the animal under control. "This is Thunder," he said to Sarah. "He's carried me through worse situations than this. He knows what he's doing." With a gentle pressure of his heels, Jake urged Thunder into the raging water. Sarah held her breath as horse and rider disappeared into the brown torrent up to Thunder's chest. The current immediately caught them, pushing them downstream even as Jake fought to maintain their diagonal course toward the far bank. For terrifying moments, it seemed as though the water might sweep them away completely, but Thunder's powerful legs found purchase on the rocky bottom and drove them steadily forward. Halfway across, a massive tree branch came rushing downstream directly toward them. Sarah gasped in alarm, certain it would strike horse and rider, but Jake had seen it coming. With a sharp word and a pull on the reins, he guided Thunder slightly upstream, and the deadly debris swept past them with only inches to spare. The near miss demonstrated just how many hidden dangers waited in the swirling water. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, Thunder's hooves found solid ground on the far bank. Jake turned the stallion around and raised his arm in a signal of success, though Sarah could see even from a distance that both horse and rider were breathing hard from the effort. The crossing was possible, but it would require every ounce of Thunder's strength and Jake's skill. Jake rested on the far side for several minutes, allowing his horse to recover while he studied the return journey. The current had pushed them nearly 50 yards downstream from their intended landing point, which meant the actual crossing was longer and more difficult than it had appeared from shore. When he finally urged Thunder back into the water, Sarah could see the grim determination on his face. The return trip seemed even more dangerous than the first crossing. Thunder was already tired, and Jake had to fight harder to keep them on the safe line he had identified. Twice Sarah saw the stallion stumble as his hooves slipped on loose rocks, and once Jake had to use his rope to help pull them away from a partially submerged boulder that could have pinned them against the current. When Jake finally emerged from the creek, both he and Thunder were exhausted and soaked with muddy water. The stallion stood with his head hanging, sides heaving, while Jake dismounted and walked stiffly to where Sarah waited with Emma. "That was harder than I expected," Jake admitted, water dripping from his hat brim. "The current is stronger than it looks from shore, and there are more obstacles in the channel than I could see." He looked at Sarah with complete honesty. "I want you to understand exactly what we're facing. This crossing is going to be the most dangerous few minutes of your life." Sarah felt her resolve wavering. Watching Jake's difficult crossings had shown her just how easily things could go wrong. One slip, one moment of poor timing, and all 3 of them could be swept away to their deaths. But the thought of Maria dying alone without family beside her strengthened her determination. "Tell me exactly what I need to do," she said quietly. Jake helped her secure Emma more tightly in her carrier, using extra strips of leather to ensure the baby could not be jarred loose no matter how roughly they were thrown about. He showed Sarah how to grip his belt with one hand while keeping her other arm protectively around Emma, and he explained the signals he would use if he needed her to shift her weight or change position during the crossing. "The most important thing is not to panic," Jake emphasized. "Thunder is going to struggle, and it's going to feel like we're out of control. The water will be loud and cold, and you'll get soaked despite our preparations. But Thunder has never failed me, and I don't intend to let him fail us today." As Sarah climbed up behind Jake, settling Emma securely between them, she felt the stallion's muscles bunched with nervous energy beneath her. Thunder clearly understood that he was about to face another dangerous crossing, and his tension was unmistakable. Jake spoke to the horse in low, reassuring tones while making final adjustments to his reins and stirrups. "Ready?" Jake asked over his shoulder. Sarah took a deep breath and tightened her grip on his belt. "Ready." Thunder stepped into the creek, and immediately Sarah felt the shocking power of the current trying to sweep them away. The water was shockingly cold even through her thick skirt, and the sound became overwhelmingly loud as they moved deeper into the channel. Emma, protected between their bodies, seemed more startled by the motion than frightened, her small hands grasping at Sarah's coat. Halfway across, disaster struck without warning. A submerged log, invisible beneath the muddy water, caught Thunder's rear legs and sent him stumbling sideways into deeper water. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah felt the stallion go completely under the surface, taking all three of them with him into the terrifying darkness of the flood. The cold water closed over Sarah's head, and she felt Jake's belt slipping from her grasp as the current tumbled them like leaves in a storm. Her lungs burned as she fought to keep hold of Emma, while struggling back toward what she hoped was the surface. Just when she thought they were all lost, Thunder's powerful legs found bottom again, and the stallion lunged upward with desperate strength. They broke the surface, gasping and coughing, but they were still in the middle of the creek with the current sweeping them rapidly downstream from their intended course. Jake was fighting to control Thunder while Sarah held Emma above the water, but she could feel her strength failing as the cold sapped her energy and the current pulled relentlessly at their bodies. "Hold on," Jake shouted above the roar of water. "We're almost there." But Sarah could see they were being carried toward a section of the creek where massive boulders created churning rapids that would surely destroy them. Thunder was swimming now rather than walking, his noble head held high above the flood, while his legs worked frantically beneath the surface. Sarah knew the stallion was giving everything he had, but she was not sure it would be enough to save them from the deadly rocks ahead. The churning rapids approached with terrifying speed as Thunder fought desperately against the relentless current. Sarah could see the white foam where water crashed against the massive boulders, and she knew that being swept into those rocks would mean death for all of them. Emma had begun crying, perhaps sensing the mortal danger they faced, but her small voice was completely lost in the thunderous roar of the flood. Jake was using every skill he had learned in 15 years of mountain riding, guiding Thunder with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, while keeping one hand free to help steady Sarah and Emma. The stallion was tiring rapidly, his powerful muscles beginning to fail under the enormous strain of fighting both the current and the weight of 3 lives depending on his strength. "There," Jake shouted, pointing toward a narrow strip of muddy bank that jutted out into the creek just before the rapids. "We have to reach that point or we're lost." Sarah could barely see the tiny refuge through the spray and muddy water, but she understood it represented their only hope of survival. Thunder seemed to understand as well, and with a surge of desperate energy, the stallion angled toward the bank. His hooves scraped against submerged rocks as he fought for any purchase that might help drive them toward safety. The current was winning. Despite Thunder's heroic efforts, they were being swept inexorably toward the deadly rapids. Sarah could feel Jake's muscles straining as he threw his weight against their downstream drift, and she tried to help by leaning in the same direction. But she knew her efforts were probably making things worse rather than better. Just when it seemed certain they would be dashed against the rocks, Thunder's front hooves found solid ground on the muddy bank. The stallion lunged forward with his last reserves of strength, driving his hindquarters up out of the water and onto the narrow strip of land. All 3 humans tumbled from his back as the exhausted horse scrambled for secure footing, and for a moment they lay gasping in the mud, hardly believing they had survived. But their relief was short-lived. The muddy bank where they had taken refuge was barely 10 feet wide and perhaps 20 feet long, surrounded on 3 sides by raging water. Behind them, a steep cliff rose almost vertically for 50 feet, offering no possibility of escape. They were trapped on a tiny island in the middle of a flood, with no apparent way to reach true safety. Sarah checked Emma frantically, her heart pounding with fear that the baby had been injured during their terrifying ordeal. But miraculously, Emma seemed unhurt, though she was soaked and cold and crying pitifully. Sarah wrapped her in the driest blanket she could find and held her close, trying to share what little body heat she had left. Jake was examining Thunder, running his hands along the stallion's legs and checking for injuries that might have occurred during their desperate struggle. The horse was trembling with exhaustion and cold, but he appeared to be unharmed except for some minor cuts on his legs from the submerged rocks. "We can't stay here," Jake said grimly, looking around their precarious refuge. "This bank is mostly soft mud held together by tree roots. If the water level rises even a little bit more, it could wash away completely." Sarah looked at the raging water surrounding them and felt despair settling over her like a cold fog. The current seemed even faster and more violent than before, and she could not imagine how they might escape from their tiny island. Thunder was clearly too exhausted to attempt another crossing, and even if he had been fresh, the odds of survival seemed impossibly small. "Is there any chance someone might come looking for us?" she asked hopefully. Jake shook his head. "I was traveling alone, and as far as I know, so were you. No one knows where we are or that we're in trouble." He studied the cliff behind them thoughtfully. "Our only chance is to find a way up that wall." Sarah followed his gaze upward and felt her heart sink further. The cliff face was nearly vertical granite, slick with moisture from the spray of the rapids. Even an experienced climber would find it challenging, and with a baby to carry it seemed completely impossible. But Jake was not ready to give up. He began examining the cliff more carefully, looking for any cracks or ledges that might provide handholds or footing. About 15 feet up, Sarah could see what appeared to be a narrow ledge running horizontally across the rock face, but reaching it would require an extremely difficult climb across smooth stone. "I think I can make it to that ledge," Jake said finally. "If I can get up there, I might be able to find a way to pull you and the baby up with a rope." Sarah realized he was talking about leaving her and Emma alone on the crumbling bank while he attempted the dangerous climb. The thought terrified her, but she could see no alternative. If they waited much longer, they might all die when their tiny refuge was washed away by the flood. Jake began removing everything unnecessary from his clothing and gear, keeping only what he absolutely needed for the climb. He fashioned a crude harness from a length of rope and explained to Sarah how she could use it to secure Emma to her chest if he managed to establish a way to pull them up. "I want you to know," he said seriously, "that if something happens to me up there, if I fall or can't find a safe route, you shouldn't wait very long before trying to get back across the creek on Thunder. He's tired, but he's tough, and he might be able to carry you and the baby to safety if you don't wait too long." Sarah nodded, though the thought of attempting the creek crossing alone with Emma was almost as terrifying as the prospect of Jake falling from the cliff. She watched with growing anxiety as he approached the base of the granite wall and began searching for his first handhold. The initial part of the climb looked relatively easy, with several small cracks and protrusions offering decent grips for hands and feet. But as Jake moved higher, the rock became smoother and more treacherous. Sarah held her breath as she watched him edge carefully across the cliff face, testing each hold carefully before committing his weight to it. Halfway to the ledge, disaster nearly struck again. A handhold that had seemed solid crumbled under Jake's grip, sending chunks of granite splashing into the creek below. For a heart-stopping moment, he hung by one hand while his feet scrambled desperately for purchase on the smooth rock. Sarah gasped and held Emma tighter, certain she was about to watch their rescuer fall to his death. But Jake's years of outdoor experience served him well. He managed to find a tiny foothold and regain his balance, then continued upward more cautiously than before. Each move was calculated and deliberate, and Sarah could see the enormous physical and mental strain the climb was placing on him. When Jake finally reached the ledge, Sarah felt a surge of relief and hope. From her position below, she could see him exploring the narrow shelf of rock, apparently looking for a way to continue upward, or perhaps a secure anchor point for a rope. After several minutes of careful examination, he called down with news that renewed her optimism. "There's a crack in the rock up here that goes all the way to the top," he shouted. "It's narrow, but I think I can chimney up it. If I can reach the top, I can lower a rope and pull you both to safety." The crack Jake had discovered was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a man's body, but it extended vertically up the cliff face like a natural chimney. Sarah watched from below as he positioned himself at the bottom of the fissure, bracing his back against one wall and his feet against the other. This technique, called chimneying, was the only way to ascend such a formation, but it required tremendous strength and endurance. Progress was painfully slow. Jake had to inch his way upward, moving only a few feet at a time before pausing to rest and gather strength for the next section. Sarah could see the enormous effort each movement required, and she began to worry that he might exhaust himself before reaching the top. The baby's crying had subsided to quiet whimpering, but Emma was clearly uncomfortable in her wet clothes, and Sarah knew they needed to find warmth and shelter soon. While Jake continued his grueling climb, Sarah noticed that the water level around their tiny refuge seemed to be rising slightly. The muddy bank that had seemed so solid when they first scrambled onto it was beginning to show signs of erosion along the edges. Small chunks of earth occasionally broke away and disappeared into the brown torrent, each loss making their island a little smaller and less secure. Thunder stood quietly nearby, his massive head hanging low with exhaustion, but his eyes alert to the danger surrounding them. The stallion's breathing had returned to normal, and Sarah could see that his strength was gradually returning. If Jake's climb failed and they were forced to attempt another creek crossing, Thunder would be their only hope of survival. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Jake's voice called down from somewhere high above. "I made it. I'm at the top. Sarah looked up but could barely see him as a tiny figure silhouetted against the sky. I'm going to secure the rope and lower it down to you. Sarah felt a surge of relief and gratitude so strong it brought tears to her eyes. Jake had risked his life to save two strangers, and now it appeared his incredible courage and skill might actually succeed in getting them all to safety. She watched eagerly as a rope appeared over the edge of the cliff and snaked down toward their tiny island. But when the rope reached the bottom, Sarah realized they faced yet another seemingly impossible challenge. The rope ended at the ledge where Jake had rested during his climb, still 15 feet above the muddy bank where she waited with Emma. Even if she could somehow climb that smooth granite wall while carrying a baby, she would never have the strength to complete such a feat. The rope doesn't reach, she called up to Jake, though she wondered if he could even hear her voice over the sound of rushing water. There was a long pause before Jake's reply came down. I'm going to try something else. Stay where you are. Sarah watched anxiously as the rope was pulled back up and disappeared over the cliff edge. She had no idea what Jake might be planning, but she trusted that his experience and ingenuity would find a solution to their predicament. Minutes passed with no sign of activity above, and Sarah began to worry that something might have happened to their rescuer. Finally, Jake appeared at the top of the cliff again, but this time he was carrying something large and awkward. As Sarah watched in amazement, he began lowering what appeared to be a fallen tree branch, easily 20 feet long and thick enough to support considerable weight. The improvised bridge reached from the cliff top all the way down to within a few feet of where Sarah stood. I found this dead pine near the edge, Jake called down. I'm going to brace it against the ledge and lower the other end as close to you as I can. You'll have to trust it to hold your weight, but it's solid wood and should be strong enough. Sarah looked at the makeshift bridge with a mixture of hope and terror. Climbing 15 feet up a slender tree trunk while carrying Emma would be incredibly dangerous, but it seemed to offer their only realistic chance of escape from the crumbling island. She secured Emma more tightly against her chest and tested her grip on the rough bark. The climb was every bit as difficult as she had feared. The pine trunk was slick with moisture and provided only marginal handholds where broken branches had left stubs of wood protruding from the main shaft. Sarah had to hook her arms around the log and inch her way upward, using her legs to maintain pressure against the sides while keeping Emma protected between her body and the wood. Halfway up, her strength began to fail. The combination of cold exhaustion and the awkward position required to climb while protecting the baby was pushing her beyond her physical limits. Her arms trembled with fatigue and she could feel her grip beginning to slip on the wet bark. Below her, the rushing water seemed to be waiting eagerly for her to fall. You're doing great, Jake's voice encouraged her from above. Just a little bit more. You can make it. With her last reserves of strength, Sarah forced herself to continue climbing. Each foot of progress required a tremendous effort of will, and by the time she reached the ledge where Jake's rope was anchored, her entire body was shaking with exhaustion. But somehow she had managed to keep Emma safe throughout the ordeal, and the baby seemed remarkably calm considering the dangerous circumstances. Jake quickly secured the rope around Sarah's waist and began hauling her and Emma up the final section to the cliff top. This part of the rescue was less physically demanding for Sarah, but no less terrifying as she spun slowly in space while Jake pulled steadily on the rope. Emma seemed to enjoy the novel sensation of flying through the air, gurgling happily despite their precarious situation. When Sarah finally reached the top of the cliff, she collapsed on solid ground with overwhelming relief. For the first time in what felt like hours, she and Emma were truly safe from the raging water below. Jake helped her move away from the cliff edge and find a comfortable place to rest while she recovered from the harrowing climb. We still have one more problem, Jake said, looking back toward the cliff. Thunder is still down there, and that bank won't hold much longer. Sarah looked down at the muddy island where the faithful stallion waited patiently. Even from the cliff top, she could see that the refuge was smaller than when they had first reached it, and chunks of earth continued to break away into the flood. Thunder had saved their lives by carrying them across the treacherous creek, and the thought of abandoning him to drown was unbearable. Can we get him up here somehow? Sarah asked, though she could not imagine how such a thing might be possible. Jake was studying the terrain around the top of the cliff, apparently looking for alternative routes that might lead back down to the creek level. There might be a way, he said thoughtfully. About a quarter-mile upstream, the cliff drops down to a more gradual slope. If I can get down there and reach Thunder, I might be able to lead him to safety. Sarah felt a stab of alarm at the thought of Jake risking his life again. He had already done far more than anyone could reasonably expect to help two strangers, and she could not bear the idea of him being swept away by the flood while trying to save her horse. "You've done enough," she said firmly. "I can't let you risk your life again for our sake." But Jake was already gathering his rope and preparing for another dangerous journey. "Thunder carried you and your baby to safety," he replied simply. "I'm not going to let him die if there's any way to prevent it." As Jake prepared to leave, Sarah realized she knew almost nothing about this man who had appeared like an answer to prayer when they needed help most desperately. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why risk so much for people you don't even know?" Jake paused in his preparations and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. 5 years ago, I was caught in a blizzard up in the high country, lost my way completely, and would have frozen to death if a family of settlers hadn't found me and taken me in. They fed me, warmed me, and put me back on the right trail, even though they didn't have much to spare." He shouldered his rope and checked his footing near the cliff edge. "They told me that kindness was meant to be passed along, not paid back. I've been looking for ways to pass it along ever since." With those words, Jake disappeared over the cliff edge, leaving Sarah alone with Emma on the windswept plateau. She could hear the sound of rushing water far below, but from her position at the top, the creek looked deceptively peaceful, like a brown ribbon winding through the valley. Only the thunderous roar revealed the deadly power hidden beneath its surface. Minutes stretched into an hour as Sarah waited anxiously for some sign of Jake's progress. Emma had fallen asleep, exhausted by their ordeal, and lay peacefully in her mother's arms despite the cold wind that swept across the exposed cliff top. Sarah found herself praying more fervently than she had since her husband's death, asking for Jake's safety and for Thunder's rescue. Finally, she heard the sound of hooves on stone and looked up to see Jake leading Thunder up a steep but navigable path that wound around the end of the cliff. Both man and horse looked tired but unharmed, and Sarah felt tears of gratitude streaming down her cheeks as she realized that all of them had somehow survived the disaster that had seemed certain to claim their lives. Maria looked far worse than Sarah had prepared herself to see. Her sister's face was gaunt and pale, and her breathing was labored and shallow. But when Maria saw Sarah entering the room with Emma in her arms, her eyes brightened with a joy that seemed to give her new strength. "Sarah," Maria whispered, reaching out weakly toward them. "You came. I was so afraid you might not get my message or that something might happen during your journey." Sarah sat carefully on the edge of the bed and placed Emma where Maria could see her clearly. The baby, perhaps sensing the importance of the moment, remained unusually quiet and still, her bright blue eyes studying her aunt's face with solemn attention. "She's beautiful," Maria breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She looks just like you did when you were a baby. What's her name?" "Emma," Sarah replied, fighting back her own tears. "Emma Maria Martinez." Maria's face lit up with surprise and pleasure at hearing her own name included in her niece's full name. She reached out with a trembling hand to touch Emma's tiny fingers, and the baby wrapped her small fist around Maria's finger with surprising strength. Over the next 3 days, Sarah rarely left Maria's bedside. Mrs. Patterson proved to be wonderfully kind, providing meals and helping to care for Emma when Sarah needed to rest. The doctor visited twice each day, but he could offer little hope, beyond keeping Maria as comfortable as possible during her final days. Despite her weakness, Maria seemed to find energy she did not know she possessed when spending time with Emma. She told Sarah stories about their childhood that brought laughter through the tears, and she sang lullabies to Emma in the sweet voice that Sarah remembered from their youth. The baby seemed to understand somehow that these moments were precious, remaining calm and content during even the longest visits. On the third evening, Maria took a turn for the worse. Her breathing became more difficult, and she drifted in and out of consciousness. Sarah held her sister's hand and whispered words of love and comfort, while Emma slept peacefully in her carrier nearby. Mrs. Patterson sat quietly in a corner chair, providing silent support through the long night vigil. Just before dawn, Maria opened her eyes one final time and looked directly at Sarah with perfect clarity. "Take care of each other," she whispered. "And remember that love never really ends. It just changes form." Those were Maria's last words. She passed away peacefully, just as the first rays of sunlight began streaming through the bedroom window, her hand still clasped in Sarah's and a peaceful smile on her face. The funeral took place 2 days later in Denver's small cemetery. Mrs. Patterson had helped Sarah make all the arrangements, and several of Maria's friends from the boarding house attended the service. Sarah was surprised and deeply touched when Jake appeared at the cemetery, having somehow learned about Maria's death, despite being busy with his railroad work. "I wanted to pay my respects," he said quietly after the service, "and I wanted to make sure you and Emma were all right." Sarah found comfort in Jake's presence during those difficult hours. He helped her handle the practical details that followed Maria's death, including arrangements to sell her sister's few belongings and settle her debts with Mrs. Patterson. His calm competence was exactly what Sarah needed during the emotional turmoil of grief. As they walked back toward town after the funeral, Jake broached the subject that Sarah had been trying not to think about. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. "Will you return to your cabin in the mountains?" Sarah had been struggling with that exact question ever since Maria's death. The cabin held many memories of her life with her late husband, but it was also isolated and lonely, perhaps not the best place to raise a baby alone. Denver offered more opportunities and the companionship of other people, but she knew no one here except Mrs. Patterson and Jake. "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted. "I've been thinking that maybe Emma and I should stay in Denver, at least for a while. There might be work here that would allow me to support us both." Jake was quiet for several moments as they continued walking. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her with a serious expression. "Sarah, I have something to tell you, and I hope you won't think I'm being too forward." Sarah felt her heart begin beating faster, uncertain what Jake might be about to say but sensing that it was something important. "The railroad job I came here for," Jake continued. "It's going to take me away from Denver for most of the summer, possibly longer. I'll be guiding survey crews through some of the most remote parts of Colorado Territory, places where it wouldn't be safe or practical to bring a woman and baby." Sarah felt a stab of disappointment, realizing she had been hoping that Jake might remain in Denver where she could continue to benefit from his friendship and support. But she understood that he had his own life and responsibilities that did not include caring for 2 people he had met by chance. "But," Jake continued, and Sarah heard something different in his voice, "when the railroad work is finished, I've been thinking about settling down somewhere permanent instead of wandering from job to job, and I've been wondering if you might consider waiting for me to come back." Sarah stared at him in amazement, hardly believing what she was hearing. "What are you saying?" Jake took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change both their lives. "I'm saying that these past few days have made me realize that I care about you and Emma more than I thought possible. I know we haven't known each other very long, but what we've been through together feels more real than anything I've experienced in years." He paused, then continued with quiet intensity. "I'm asking if you would consider marrying me when I return from the railroad work." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but for the first time in many days, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The man who had saved their lives was offering to make them a permanent part of his own life, to provide the security and companionship that she and Emma would need in the years ahead. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will wait for you." 6 months later, when Jake returned from his successful railroad survey, he found Sarah working as a seamstress in Denver and living in a small apartment near Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Emma had grown into a happy, healthy baby who remembered Jake well enough to reach for him the moment he walked through the door. They were married the following spring, in a simple ceremony attended by Mrs. Patterson and several friends Sarah had made during her months in Denver. As Jake had promised, he gave up his wandering life to settle permanently in the growing city, where he established a successful freight business that eventually made them quite prosperous. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand, Sarah would tell her daughter the story of how a stranger's kindness had saved their lives and brought them a new family. She always ended the story with Jake's words about kindness being meant to be passed along. And throughout her life, Emma looked for ways to help others who found themselves in desperate circumstances, the creek crossing that had nearly cost them. Their lives became the foundation of a love that lasted for decades, proving that sometimes the most dangerous moments in our lives can also be the most transformative. Sarah never forgot that a lone rider's willingness to risk everything for two strangers had given her not just her life, but a future filled with hope and happiness. Jake helped Sarah and Emma mount Thunder, and they began the journey away from the dangerous creek toward higher ground where they could make camp and recover from their ordeal. As they rode, Sarah found herself looking back at the raging water that had so nearly destroyed them, marveling at how quickly a peaceful mountain stream could become a deadly enemy. "How far are we from Denver now?" she asked Jake as they settled into a steady pace on safer ground. "About 120 miles, Jake replied. "But the worst of the mountain crossing is behind us now. If we make good time and the weather holds, we should reach the city in 4 or 5 days." Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope as they put the treacherous creek behind them. Maria was still alive, still waiting for her to arrive, and now it seemed possible that they might actually complete their journey safely. The kindness of a stranger had saved their lives, and Sarah knew she would spend the rest of her days looking for ways to pass that kindness along to others who might need help in their darkest moments. The journey toward Denver took on a completely different character after their harrowing experience at Thunder Creek. Jake proved to be an excellent traveling companion, knowledgeable about every trail and shortcut through the mountains, and his presence made Sarah feel safer than she had since leaving her cabin. Emma seemed to have taken a liking to their rescuer as well, often reaching toward him with her tiny hands and gurgling happily when he spoke to her in gentle tones. As they traveled, Sarah learned more about the man who had risked his life to save them. Jake had been a scout for the Army during his younger years, which explained his exceptional skills in wilderness survival and his calm competence in dangerous situations. After leaving military service, he had worked as a guide for mining expeditions and surveying parties, spending most of his adult life in the remote corners of Colorado Territory. "I was heading to Denver myself when I came across your trail," Jake explained as they made camp on their 4th evening since the creek crossing. "Got a job offer to guide a railroad survey crew through the Rockies. Good pay, and it'll keep me busy through the summer months." Sarah felt a pang of guilt at the realization that their rescue had probably delayed Jake's arrival in Denver, possibly costing him the job opportunity. When she mentioned her concern, however, Jake just smiled and shook his head. "Railroad work will wait," he said simply. "Besides, I've learned that the most important journeys aren't always the ones we plan for ourselves." They had made excellent time since leaving Thunder Creek behind, covering nearly 30 miles each day despite the challenging terrain. Emma had adapted remarkably well to life on the trail, sleeping peacefully in her carrier during the day and feeding contentedly each evening when they stopped to make camp. The baby seemed to thrive on the outdoor adventure, becoming more alert and responsive with each passing day. On their 5th morning, they crested a ridge and saw Denver spread out in the valley below them. The city was larger than Sarah had expected, with dozens of substantial buildings and a busy network of streets filled with wagons, riders, and pedestrians. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and the sound of hammering and sawing indicated that construction was proceeding rapidly as more settlers arrived to take advantage of Colorado's mining boom. "We'll be there by afternoon," Jake announced, and Sarah felt her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. After more than a week of dangerous travel, she was finally going to see Maria again, but she had no idea what condition her sister might be in after so many days of illness. As they descended toward the city, they passed increasing numbers of other travelers heading in both directions. Some were families in covered wagons seeking new opportunities in the West, while others were miners and businessmen traveling alone on horseback. Several people they encountered asked about trail conditions in the mountains, and Jake always took time to warn them about the dangerous creek crossings and recent weather problems. When they finally reached Denver's Main Street, Sarah was overwhelmed by the bustle and noise of city life after so many days in the wilderness. Emma seemed equally startled by the sudden change, her eyes wide as she took in the crowds of people and the unfamiliar sounds of urban activity. Jake led them through the maze of streets with the confidence of someone who had visited the city many times before. Sarah's first priority was finding the boarding house where Maria had been staying. Jake helped her locate the address that had been mentioned in the telegram, and they discovered it was a modest but clean establishment, run by a kindly widow named Mrs. Patterson. When Sarah introduced herself and explained her relationship to Maria, The older woman's face lit up with relief and joy. "Oh, my dear, thank goodness you've come," Mrs. Patterson exclaimed, ushering them into the boarding house parlor. "Your sister has been asking for you constantly. She's been so worried that you might not receive her message in time." Sarah felt tears of relief at the news that Maria was still alive and conscious. She had feared throughout their journey that they might arrive too late, that the delays caused by weather and the dangerous creek crossing might have cost them their final chance to be together. "How is she?" Sarah asked anxiously. "Is she in much pain?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. "She's very weak, dear, and the doctor says there isn't much time left. But she's been holding on with remarkable determination, and I believe she was waiting for you to arrive." Jake had remained quietly in the background during this conversation, understanding that this was a private family matter. Now he stepped forward and touched his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I'll be taking my leave now," he said to Sarah. "You'll want to spend time with your sister, and I need to report to my railroad contact before the day gets too late." Sarah realized with a shock that she was about to say goodbye to the man who had saved their lives. In all the excitement of reaching Denver and the anxiety about Maria's condition, she had not thought about the fact that their paths would soon diverge. The idea of parting from Jake felt almost like losing a member of her family. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our lives and you risked everything to help two strangers. There must be some way I can repay your kindness." Jake smiled and reached out to gently touch Emma's cheek. The baby grabbed his finger with her tiny hand and held on tightly, as if she too was reluctant to see him go. "Just remember what I told you about kindness being meant to be passed along," he said softly. "Someday you'll have the chance to help someone else who's in trouble. And when that time comes, you'll know what to do." Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening to this exchange with growing curiosity, suddenly spoke up. "Forgive me for interrupting," she said, "but did you say something about saving lives? What happened during your journey?" Sarah briefly recounted their experience at Thunder Creek, describing how Jake had risked everything to rescue them from the flood. Mrs. Patterson listened with amazement, her eyes growing wider with each detail of their dangerous adventure. "My goodness," she breathed when Sarah finished the story. "You're both lucky to be alive. And you, sir," she turned to Jake, "are a true hero. I've heard many stories of travelers helping each other in the wilderness, but nothing quite so dramatic as what you've described." Jake looked uncomfortable with the praise and moved toward the door. "I really should be going," he said. "The railroad men don't like to be kept waiting." But Mrs. Patterson was not finished with him yet. "Before you leave," she said firmly, "I want to know where you'll be staying in Denver. If this dear woman needs anything during her time here, she should be able to find you." Jake gave them the name of a hotel where he expected to be staying, at least until his railroad assignment began. Sarah memorized the information, though she was not sure when she might have time to seek him out again. Her immediate concern had to be Maria, and she had no idea how long her sister might have left to live. After Jake departed, Mrs. Patterson led Sarah upstairs to Maria's room. Sarah's heart pounded with anticipation and anxiety as they approached the door, and she held Emma protectively against her chest, suddenly uncertain whether exposing the baby to serious illness was wise. But when Mrs. Patterson knocked softly and opened the door, Sarah forgot all her concerns and rushed to the bedside where her sister lay waiting.